I'm Ed Adams, and this is the weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. Florida is an interesting place. If you spend some decent time there and not in the Panhandle, which is basically a completely different state, you'd think that everyone in Florida came from either New York or Cuba, or from Cuba via New York. Being surrounded by people who sound like they stepped straight out of Brooklyn is a pretty common occurrence. Not everyone who leaves New York makes it to Florida right away, though. Many stop for a decade or two along the way at predictable places. All of these spots where New Yorkers are commonly found on their long migration to the Sunshine State are along Interstate 95. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond, and Fayetteville are all common way stations along the way to Florida. This is an interesting phenomena, and I think it's an easy way to show that cultural identities aren't limited to administrative boundaries like states and counties. People aren't like puzzle pieces that fit neatly into one place or another. We're more like water that flows along predictable patterns, but ultimately kind of gets everywhere. I was really just reminded of that today when I met a Frenchman with a German surname. If you get the opportunity to travel along the central to western portions of mid-Atlantic states, down through to the southeastern U.S., you'll probably notice that the people along this corridor have a lot in common with each other. The American political strategist James Carville once commented that between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, there were about 200 miles of Alabama. I think that's actually a little unfair, but if you spend some time in the area, you probably understand what he's getting at. The people of central Pennsylvania and the people of Alabama seem to have more in common with each other than those central Pennsylvanians have with either end of their own state. You see a similarly stark difference between the upcountry and lowcountry South Carolinians. There's a humorous map that I've come across a few times on the internet that claims to be a map of South Carolina as seen from Charleston. It of course makes the lowcountry seem idyllic and the upcountry like knuckle-dragging mouth-breathers, terms actually used on the map. All of this is due to the I-95 effect, or to put it more clearly, how people got to where they are. For me, the study of how people groups got to where they are is hands down the most interesting part of doing genealogy. So much of the world around me has made more sense to me after figuring out why certain people live where they live and how they got there. Today, I want to talk about the I-95 of the colonial era. No, not the Atlantic coast, which probably saw more traffic, but I'm talking a little bit inland. Let's talk about the Great Wagon Road. Now, the Great Wagon Road certainly wasn't a road as we think of them today, and it wasn't even really a road from the urban 18th century perspective. It was just a collection of dirt paths through the woods, originally created by tribes moving along inland routes to trade with each other. By 1744, British colonists had gained the ability to settle along those paths more or less peacefully, so from 1744 to the outbreak of the French and Indian War, these old tribal trading paths became clogged with Conestoga wagons as Scots-Irish and Germans from Pennsylvania began looking for more opportunity. After 1763, with the end of hostilities and a complete remaking of the British and tribal politics of the backcountry, the floodgates opened and these areas would never be the same. The Great Wagon Road ran loosely from Pennsylvania in the north, out towards Gettysburg, and then down along the Shenandoah Valley to Roanoke, which was then known as Big Lick. From there, a leg of it split west and crossed through the Appalachians, down towards present-day Knoxville, Tennessee, and another leg split south, cutting North Carolina and South Carolina in half from east to west, terminating in Augusta, Georgia. Much like the interstates of today, most people who traveled the Great Wagon Road didn't necessarily start at the beginning and travel all the way to the end, although some certainly did. There were about 24 main stopping points along the road, many of them fairly notable towns and cities today, like Hagerstown, Winchester, Stanton, Roanoke, Winston-Salem, and Charlotte. The general settlement pattern of the two main ethnic groups that traveled the road, namely Germans and Scots-Irish, was for the Germans to settle along the path and to the east, and for the Scots-Irish to settle along the path and to the west. In the case of the Scots-Irish, they generally didn't come along the path alone or in single families. They traveled in sizable clans of 3 or 4 intermarried extended families. They also traveled in significantly larger numbers than just about any other group during that time. Between 1717 and 1800, about 250,000 immigrants came over from the British Isles, and about 210 of those were Scots-Irish. by most accounts, that's about double the number of Germans who immigrated during that same time period. Many who settled in North Carolina found themselves scammed by disreputable land agents, and those who settled further on in South Carolina found themselves on the frontier with little administrative support from government officials. These conditions, along with a well-traveled set of roads running northeast through the colonies, led to an environment where there were more social and economic ties along the road than over shorter distances within a single colony. In fact, in both Carolinas, over a few years in the mid-1760s through to 1771, the backcountry colonists found themselves at odds with their coastal counterparts and broke into open violence a few times. This is a situation that hasn't really changed much over the last few centuries either. Politics in the Carolinas are heavily geographic, with South Carolina probably showing the starkest differences between coastal and inland priorities. I could go on. Like I said, I find this stuff fascinating. History has consequences, and it shapes so much of the environment that we live in today, but so many people grow up in it, blind to the metaphorical ghosts all around them. But how does any of this knowledge help us with our genealogy? Well, for starters, if you haven't already, go back and listen to the episode titled History Matters. The Great Wagon Road provided the geography by which a large portion of the eastern United States was settled by Europeans. You may very well have had ancestors who moved along this path to their homes, and for many people, towns along the path mark brick walls beyond which they cannot see. Let's say that you had an ancestor who settled in northeast Tennessee back in the early 1770s. Of course, it wasn't Tennessee then, but if somewhere within the Watauga settlement area is your brick wall, have a look at the route of the wagon road. Like I said, the Scots-Irish traveled in large family groups, but they didn't all end up in the same location. While they did many things as a clan, just as we are today, each person who migrated along the Great Wagon Road was an individual and made their own decisions. It was not uncommon that if a member of one family had someone who was sick or came upon a town where there was a need for their particular expertise, or if they just decided they liked the looks of Big Lick, Virginia, and they didn't want to head on any further, they might separate from the rest of their travel group. So if you've got that brick wall in East Tennessee, try looking at Roanoke or Fincastle or Lexington in Virginia. You might find that your surname of interest is quite common in those towns. Look at the first names to see if you find patterns, and check and see if any of the people that you find in these towns are covered as a part of DNA projects. You might even get lucky and find your ancestor in some of the probate documents for a relative of theirs further up the road. It was not that uncommon for people to travel fairly substantial distances along this road even after they had settled in their final destination. In 1767, a man named Thomas Woodward chased a group of horse thieves up this road from southwest South Carolina all the way up to the North Carolina-Virginia border, over some horses. So these people weren't nearly as geographically restricted as we sometimes think. Yes, the majority of their activities took place within about 20 miles of their home, but if you think of it, the same could be said for most of us. But we still make time to hit the beach from time to time. So it's entirely possible that your brick wall family had semi-regular contact with relatives elsewhere along the migration path. This, of course, works in both directions. My example was from one of the endpoints of the road, but if your ancestors settled anywhere along this path, try looking both up and down the road for your surname of interest and any surnames that are connected with yours. The lesson here is expandable to just about any predictable migration pattern, but this is one of the big early ones in American history. Just remember, all those New Yorkers in Orlando didn't just appear out of nowhere. Once you learn how the group at large moved, you can extrapolate that to figure out things about individual families. Do you have any ancestors that came down the Great Wagon Road? If so, I'd love to hear about them. Try reaching out to me on Twitter, @TheWGTPod. If you're enjoying what you're hearing each week, leave a review. Either way, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.